Welcome to the Climate Diplomacy Podcast, a podcast from the Berlin-based Think and Do tank Adelphi, bringing you the latest insights and debates in international climate diplomacy and security. We are your hosts, Raquel Monayer.
And I'm Alexandra Steinkraus. In this series, you will hear from experts and practitioners offering their take on climate foreign policy, climate-related impacts to security, and promoting peace and resilience in the changing climate. For more information, please visit climate-diplomacy.org or follow at ClimateDiplo on Twitter. Welcome back to the Climate Diplomacy Podcast. In today's episode, we'll be exploring what fragility looks like in areas where violence is systemic rather than militarized, specifically looking at Bangladesh. We'll be discussing dynamics like internal and cross-border migration, border securitization, and the role of community networks. We're very lucky to be joined by Tasnia Khandaker Prova, lead on climate research at the Center for Peace and Justice at BRAC University. She also has been leading the research project Understanding Fragility in Bangladesh's climate change-affected borderland. Welcome to the podcast. Really happy to talk to you today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, welcome also from my side. And we always like to start out with a scene setter to give our listeners some background to the topic. So maybe you could start by giving a brief overview of climate change in Bangladesh. More specifically, what are the climate events that are having the greatest impacts in the country?
So Bangladesh is a small but a beautiful country. I'm privileged to call my home. But Bangladesh has struggled quite a bit on the climate change front. It has ranked high consistently on climate risk indexes annually. And by 2050, there are predictions that 17% of its land might be lost due to rising sea levels. It could essentially displace over 13 million people. We are also affected by, especially the study sites that I was able to do this research on. These areas are affected by cyclones and floods annually. So every year there's a massive climate disruption that happens in the form of disasters. But at the same time, slow climate events have started to make a lot of noise and have taken extreme forms. 2024 saw the longest heat wave the country has experienced on record. And then there are predictable rain patterns that already overwhelm existing planning systems. So there's a combination of both slow and sudden climate disruptions, but we rank high on these very sad lists.
Yeah, that's right. Now, we know these impacts are affecting people, and it's the case everywhere that the most vulnerable groups will suffer disproportionately. Unfortunately, that's always the case. But if we're thinking about what is specific to the Bangladesh context, how exactly are these climate disasters and also environmental degradation impacting vulnerability and vulnerable groups in the country?
So we were able to draw up marginalization criteria for us to select households. And so we tried to have a very intersectional focus when we looked at the groups that we wanted as a part of our research. And we realized, and it's no surprise to anybody, that climate change deepens already existing high levels of income and wealth disparities and precarity. So in the Southwest, for example, there's a combination of, they're not built up cities. These are villages, and there's a combination of thatched houses and bricked homes. And so if you were to look at a family with a thatched house, a climate disruption puts them at a higher risk of their house sustaining damages or if not completely destroyed. And so this person who's already not doing as economically well as someone with a bricked home has to then reinvest savings or go further into debt to make sure that he has a home following a disaster. And that's just one example. Across the Southwest, people are involved in farming and fishing as their major sources of income. And so we really see that these incomes taking a big hit. And in a governance system that is so dependent on people knowing the right groups or being affiliated with the right political group or social group for you to get necessarily help. This also means that marginalized groups have lower access to infrastructures of support, and that is worsened with climate change. And then we see climate infrastructure not prioritizing inclusivity, where women have a difficult time getting to cyclone shelters and finding safety. And in the absence of electricity in some of these households, we see extreme weather events throw people deeper into precarity. And then, of course, women. women are so disproportionately affected across all boards, from being pushed into early marriages, trafficking, abuse, unpaid labor, health challenges very specific to women. For example, in one of our study sites, because of salinity intrusion, and for women being in saline waters for longer periods of time, their reproductive health was affected. And so there are different layers to this, different criteria depending on age, gender, access to resources, and the profession that a person has, that vulnerability becomes compounded. But in the research, that is what we try to focus on, that not every household, or even within the same household, not every member is affected the same way.
Thanks very much. When we're talking, especially in the context of climate security, talking about disproportionate impacts, especially on marginal groups, things that comes to livelihoods, political, different social groups, things that we hear so frequently. But the health challenges that you mentioned that are specific to women and also reproductive health is somewhat like an underexplored area there. I haven't seen that pop up so much. And in addition to some of these things, your research also focuses on borderlands, which, at least if I try to picture something in my head, I picture a very barren land, very heavy securitization, and a lot of potential environmental impacts. Is that picture consistent with your research, and what unique dynamics exist in these kinds of areas?
So the Bangladesh-India borderlands is the 5th largest land border in the world. And so some pockets resemble the description that you just gave, and other pockets are just free-flowing, very porous. To a point, I remember when we were doing the scoping that preceded this study, there was a cow sitting on a patch of land. And I remember asking my co-researcher if the cow was Bangladeshi or Indian, and we didn't know. Because there was this hut that had an Indian flag, and that was the only indication that Indian territory start from that front. But in other spaces, there's obviously high security with different checkpoints, people asking you what you're doing here. And these borderlands, like other borderlands, have free flowing of goods and sometimes legal goods. And so people are on high alert as to, who these random people are with notebooks. But yeah, I think going back to the example of animals, there was another border town that we looked at that shares a transboundary river with India. And there's a big chunk of the border shared by these two countries that go through a river. So just on the other side, the farmers working on their land are Indians. And it's just, you don't see barbed wires anywhere, but you do see ducks moving back and forth. And again, I wondered if the ducks were Bangladeshi or Indian. So essentially just bringing this conversation back to why we focus on borderlands. These are contested spaces where central aspiration of sovereignty plays into the fragility that communities already face. And what we realized is that the politics of visibility plays a role in how spaces are understood. So if you were to look at a border town and you are asking whether households are fragile, people tend to only look at border security apparatus and how that plays into fragility. But the fact that a border town is also climate affected, that connection is not studied as thoroughly. And then you look at climate vulnerable areas or coastal villages that have seen climate disruptions one after the other. People tend to forget that these are also bordering areas where there's maritime borders or historically connected spaces where people do move back and forth. And that leaves that introspective lens. And so what we try to do is bring two of these indicators together and ask, how is the fragility in these areas shaped by both of these systems playing a role in households? So this would include, for example, looking at transboundary floods in border towns, or wondering why embankments in border towns haven't been as secure, despite promises by elected officials that they would be better built. And this notion of, oh, but this is a border town, there are different rules. At least that's what we understood from our community respondents. The fact that there's temporary cross-border movements when the harvest season ends. And it allows that mobility, free flowing of people, allows people to adapt to climate change or climate disruptions in terms of their farmlands being affected. And so on top of that, if you look at individual families, there was a widow whose husband was killed by a border security official on the other side is now having to earn a living for the entire family, is the primary earner. And it's done through farming. And because of climate change, that layered fragility of her being a sole breadwinner and a female farmer, it's again compounded, it's complex. And so we really wanted to use community narratives to give a better voice to that complexity, that you can't just look at one or the other to show a holistic picture.
Thanks. We also want to talk about aid a little bit in this conversation. I mean, it's such a topic that's on everyone's radars right now. And speaking earlier about these different lists that Bangladesh has been at the top of, Bangladesh is also within the top 5 of recipients of foreign aid and official development assistance, according to the World Bank. And can you briefly outline some of the ways that this traditional aid fails to meet the needs of these communities that you've been mentioning and of recipients?
Our research is largely based on our conversations with community members and conversations with the experts. They range from being researchers themselves to people who are aid practitioners. And I wouldn't say that traditional aid has failed these systems, but it definitely has fallen short from reaching to every single, obviously, vulnerable household in the area. And the fact that it has also played into that inequality dynamic that we wanted to address. And there was someone who we interviewed who said that the development sector as a whole in Bangladesh has different waves. And so we had family planning at one point, and that shifted to climate change. And now we're seeing a wave of energy come up. And so in Bangladesh in particular, the development sector is not only something that international actors are pushing for. It is something that has been instrumental in state building. So Bangladesh houses the largest NGO in the world, and they've played a substantial role in driving instrumental change alongside the government. And so, of course, we've seen that this notion of aid being very project specific is something that is critiqued by community respondents because they see, for example, someone giving them climate resilient seeds or trying to support them by buying them a bunch of goats. And then after 2 years, that support or mentoring is gone. And so what really happens there is something that community respondents have described as a gap of resilience necessarily isn't built simply because someone has paid for a toilet. It doesn't mean that fragility is absent now. It means that they've received aid in some form, but the square-toed language used in development aid is also, I think, was seen as problematic, especially when people talk about empowerment. What is empowerment and how are you defining empowerment in these spaces that are constantly facing new kinds of fragility as seasons change? And so I think from what we understood from deep conversations is that there's a trust gap there. And the trust gap has happened because they don't feel listened to. And development aid has also become politicized, where I was standing in front of a respondent with a notebook, and she just kept telling me what her name was. And she asked me to write her name, and she wanted to see me write her name. And so after a few months of being in these spaces, I realized is that they just want to be on a list. And the list is off development aid, off being a particular receiver of some support. But for you to get on that list, the journey is quite blurry and complex and politicized, where you have to know the right people. Maybe an elected official or someone high above can affect who is on that list. And so that creates a space of what is development aid? Is it completely outside of the political process? And so there are these reflections that we've realized in terms of how the structure is formed and how the actual support that they're getting. But I do recognize that there isn't a lot of money that these spaces get, especially when you're not being recognized as climate vulnerable. You don't see a lot of climate money. And in the absence of that money, we see a lot of community resilience. And we've realized is that community advocacy in trying to ensure that their resources, so water resources or land resources are safe, have proven to be far more effective than this aid structure. But what has also been even more successful is the partnership with development agencies and community-built advocacy platforms. And so that's, I think, what the community wants to see more of, the development aid or NGO sector supporting existing community resistance.
I know that on the aid topic, there's a lot to mourn in the current political context. It's a difficult one, but to look into a more hopeful aspect of this, when it comes to what you were saying, right, about empowerment. I don't know. I find it very exciting to see the international community starting to grasp that local communities and community networks, they must not only be included in processes just for the sake of inclusion, but because there are real tangible benefits for the outcomes of projects and programs when communities are involved. For those of us who navigate these spaces, it does feel like recognition is there and maybe even reaching some higher decision-making levels to a great extent. But many of us are also at the same time still wondering how exactly to do this, which in turn is so important to understand how to engage correctly with communities. So to this end, it would be great to hear from you. How can community-led participatory methods address or even reverse these complex power structures that you were just mentioning, and ultimately help improve the delivery and the efficiency of climate change response?
I think the impetus that guides us is the acknowledgement that the vantage point of an outsider is simply deficient. We don't, and we will never be able to just visit somewhere and be confident in our claims of what this space entails and how does fragility take shape in these spaces. And so the Center for Peace and Justice has worked with community-based participatory methods in other borderlands of Bangladesh. We've done this throughout a couple of years, but the focus area were refugees. So Bangladesh is a refugee hosting country and hosts over 1 million Rohingya refugees in its Bangladesh-Myanmar borderlands. And so the intention was to see if the same methodology can be replicated to understand the different borderland, to understand those complexities. Of course, we had to make adjustments because when we work with refugees, we're working with populations refrained by a camping system and different layers of governance and securitization. And when we moved to Bangladesh India borderlands, we were dealing with free citizens, well, people the space has been called the test site for climate adaptation. So they've seen outsiders wearing different clothes, that they're easily identifiable, that they're not from this area, asking questions about climate change. They've been through it. And so there was anticipating an effort that we needed to make as well for the community wanting to share their story, because they need to also see where this is going. They need to see the purpose of them investing their time and effort. What we did was get young research enthusiasts from the area as a part of the broader research team. And so they were involved in every single element of the research process, from designing questions to asking whether this question even makes sense in this context, to developing trust with community respondents, to visiting their houses and already having a world of information that they have as background before they meet a household member. I remember this one community researcher who was interviewing a single mom, and the kid was not having it. They were not happy that a random person was taking so much time away from his mom. And so at one point, one of our community researchers takes out a candy and takes permission, obviously, and offers it to the kid. I had never seen that candy before in my life, even though we were in the same country. I just didn't know it existed. And the kid was ecstatic. And he told me, like, this is the candy of the area. Like, this is. And so in border spaces, especially, like, the flow of goods and movements are so particular. And so people with lived experiences in these areas know best as to how households would respond. And that's just one example of how comfortable and enlightening that entire process was of interacting with young community researchers. And so even when they were interacting with households, trust was almost automatically there because they're speaking in the same dialect that they're used to. They're talking about climate disruptions that have not only affected the household, but themselves. And they themselves were first responders in their locations. And so it comes from a point of knowledge, but also shared frustration. And beyond data extraction, community-based methods create this platform where we can co-create knowledge and give ownership back to these young research enthusiasts that this is a product of your doing and not just outsiders coming in and telling everyone how it needs to be.
I think you've outlined a lot of really key lessons and things to be considered, both on implementation, but as well as from donor governments and some of these big funds. And I guess now, Raquel, you opened up for a bit of a positive outlook and some good to-dos. And I guess I'm going to bring us back a little bit into the unfortunate reality of today, where, Tasnia, you've rightfully mentioned that development has been very politicized on different levels. So given today's uncertain political climate, shifting priorities, and large cuts that we've seen in the international aid sector, are there already impacts being felt in Bangladesh? And what kinds of shifts are already being anticipated for future work?
So I want to contextualize my answer on the lived experiences or the reflections of lived experiences that we've collected in these climate affected borderlands. And I'd like to start off by saying that I'm optimistic most days, but I'm still optimistic about the sector, particularly not because of conversations that I've had with actors with offices in New York City or Berlin or these high level officials who are guiding this process, but just reflecting on conversations I've had with local practitioners in Bangladesh who worked for good and for serving people for 30, 40 years. And when you start having conversations with them, you almost want to advocate for them because it's not like they're getting paid as much as they should. But they're driven by that motivation of resilience must be shared. If I have something that I can contribute to society and shrink that gap in inequality, then I should be playing my part. And it was almost like a spiritual experience of just interacting with people who have dedicated their entire lives to serving other people. And I don't think any political system, any elected bodies, any disruption on that front can take that away. And so what I envision, and this could be optimistic and people might be listening to me and being like, this is not a romantic comedy, Tasnia. But I do envision their sector going through radical transformation, and the calls for localization, as they're heightened, people will, I think, learn to appreciate community-based solutions even more, especially with funding cuts. But they'll also realize that community solutions have always worked even better than some of these top-down approaches. They've sustained that project timeline. From examples that we've gotten in the Southwest, there's a river called Adi Jamuna, which is a small tributary of the transboundary river I was talking about earlier. And because the semantics or administrative bodies taking advantage, the river was named or redefined as a canal. And once the river was called a canal, people could block people's free access to water. And it took about over a decade of advocacy, absolutely grassroots level, of sending, I think the key informant said he sent over 1,000 letters across different levels of governments to ensure that that small river is free. And it worked. And the fact is true that development aid is just simply not designed for that sustainability. And especially in Bangladesh, where climate precarity is so intertwined with how infrastructure is designed, what governance systems is responsible for the area. It's important, again, to re-emphasize that community solutions have worked, they're willing, they're present, and they're there. Before I decided to do research, my career started in development practice. And I worked at a small grassroots NGO based in Dhaka, but we worked with street dogs. So you can imagine, like, street dogs isn't necessarily really high up on everybody's interest at that point of time. And I think 2 years later, we were out of funding. and government wasn't really interested in taking up the mantle. And we had the organization sustained through community financing. Not saying that it's a perfect solution, not saying that there weren't days where everything felt like it was about to close down. So, of course, international aid and the NGO sector needs to strategize and partner with community members in how they can design these solutions for themselves. And there has to be some hand-holding as well. But I think in the future, what we will see is a space, and hopefully see that a space for greater nuance. And I think that is what is also missing now in some of the very fear-motivated conversations around aid. A lot of nuance is missing. It's like you have to prove again that climate change is real, or that the gendered lens is not some sort of a propaganda. So again, I think after us all collectively being very annoyed at whatever is happening, we'll come together and create that space for nuance. Yeah.
Thanks very much. You make a good point, especially in the absence of some future international funding. The community-driven solutions that have historically worked will still be there, and hopefully that can lead to better structures in the future to make sure that aid is more bottom up as opposed to being top down. And speaking of missing nuance, we'd be amiss if we didn't talk about some level of global discourse during the Climate Diplomacy podcast. And in terms of climate security discourse, I think the Asia-Pacific region remains largely underexplored and underrepresented within the global discourse. And that's despite the fact that the region experiences on average 6 natural disasters a year, which is twice as many as in Latin America and the Caribbean, and roughly 3 times as many as sub-Saharan Africa experiences. And a lot of this, I think, stems from not having the right nuance or not having the right conversation, with assuming that a conversation being had in sub-Saharan Africa or at different headquarters is going to resonate with both different governments, different regions, as well as within the local communities that we've been talking about. So how can local climate security risks be reconciled with national security priorities and also uplifted in some of these global conversations?
When we've talked about security throughout this project, we've always spoken about human security. And I think that is quite missing. And it's shocking to me when we talk about climate security. I think that notion of nation building and protecting and stopping migrants, and this imagery of we need to protect ourselves from impacts that are more readily felt in Asia. That disparity in discussion, I think, has honestly left me floored sometimes. I've been in international conferences where I felt like I was in the wrong place, that I'm in the wrong workshop, because we cannot be so nation driven that the humanity of the people who are facing climate impacts from the front lines, that they are deprioritized. And I think we oscillate between either trying to prove that climate change is real and is a threat, and do another extreme of, climate change is a very real part of our future. So of course there's going to be collateral damage. And that collateral damage is almost always found in Asia, because you don't have a lot of attention, and the scale at which people are displaced and people are dispossessed of peace, of land, of livelihoods, it's not talked about. And you don't have a response apparatus that recognizes the scale at which things are worsening. I think the alternative to this is being more holistic about how we look at security, understanding that if the human is secure and feels secure in a particular area, they're more likely to make the nation secure and sovereignty secure. And frankly, I don't anticipate climate migration, even within Bangladesh, to spill over into its neighbors, so much so that it creates a trigger. Climate migration is still, for the most part, internal migration. And that recognition of people don't want to leave their homes. it's not that hard to understand. It frustrates me as a person, like when this notion of climate migration, or especially in like international spaces, I think there are underlying sort of assumptions that, oh, they're looking for better opportunities there. Of course they want to move. Of course they want to leave. No, not everyone wants to leave. Of course, the choice to leave would be great. If you want the choice to travel would be great, but it doesn't mean that they want to leave everything that they know behind. And we see that not only in cross-boundary migration patterns, but even within the border town that we're investigating. People have been moved or forced to move from very climate vulnerable region to somewhere further inland. And they miss those spaces. They miss their homes. And I think that human aspect of how climate change disrupts lives is largely missing in our conversations of security. And the fact that whenever we talk about national security, people need to also acknowledge that in Asia, there's a higher number of countries that are hosting refugees of big numbers, and they're not signed on to the Refugee Convention, but are sharing responsibility, not in perfect ways, but in ways that can be critiqued and be fixed, but they're still doing their part. And I think that also deserves international recognition. And I think another dynamic in terms of national security would be really recognizing what are community-based solutions or community-supported solutions and what are solutions that are not serving them. So really also being critical of adaptive practices, or even private companies coming into these spaces with the claim that they're going to do something to change lives, but be very skeptical, optimistically skeptical, I think is where I want people to be.
I like that, optimistically skeptical.
That is a very good way to navigate today's confusing landscape.
Yes. Yeah. Honestly, I think otherwise, I think we'll lose our minds. So that is the route I take. And I urge you, both of you, to take.
It's true. And I everyone that's listening, I think that's a good approach. We can't get so absorbed with some of these sensationalized headlines that, of course, are in a lot of cases rightfully pointing out different dynamics that will make the work that you're doing, that other people in the space are also doing, harder. But keeping some level of sanity is necessary to keep going. And like you mentioned, some of these researchers working for 30, 40 years in different communities in Bangladesh, like that longevity is needed to have any progress.
Yeah, we have to keep centered. I mean, everyone is trying to keep centered, and we don't have to invent anything. There are good things going on to focus on. So it was good to hear them from you too.
Of course. I think it's about not looking at vulnerability as a number of checkboxes of whether someone meets that or not, but acknowledging that fragility takes shape in complex settings and has complex implications. The same person who's talking about how they're struggling with food insecurity is also inviting me to have lunch with them, is the reality of most of the world and most of Bangladesh. And I think it's through community-based research and community-based solutions. The goal is to bring that narrative back and again, bring back nuance.
This month's episode provides a comprehensive overview of the intricate challenges faced in Bangladesh, in particular on the intersection of climate change, fragility, and systemic violence. Bangladesh grapples with severe climate disruptions, namely rising sea levels and extreme weather events like extreme heat, drought, and cyclones. These dynamics aggravate existing vulnerabilities and complex social dynamics, and the socio-political landscape is complex, with issues present like internal and cross-border migration and borderland securitization between Bangladesh and India. This intensifies fragility within local communities. In this context, the role of community networks has emerged as crucial in addressing these challenges, providing a foundation for resilience and adaptation amidst climate unpredictability and social marginalization. Our discussion emphasized the limitations of traditional aid structures and offers ideas for innovative funding strategies that better meet the needs of communities. The discussion further emphasized the need for a paradigm shift towards a more holistic approach to development and resilience building, with a focus on community-led solutions in climate-affected borderlands in Bangladesh. Thank you so much for joining us on this month's podcast episode. It was wonderful meeting you at the Berlin Climate and Security Conference last year. I'm really glad we could have a longer conversation about some of your work.
I loved a very efficient podcast episode, to be fair.
This was the Climate Diplomacy Podcast. We'll be back with another episode in the next few weeks. You can follow our latest updates on LinkedIn and Blue Sky under Climate Diplomacy and Security. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, goodbye.